Someone had been watching Dion Garrett sleep. Not a stranger, not a random hacker. Someone who knew exactly where he moved after losing everything. Someone who planted a device in his network before he even unpacked his bags. Someone who paid a kid 42 meters away to record every room, every hour, every night. 9 weeks of footage in households. One man, and who was never supposed to find out. But Dion Garrett spent 15 years reading networks the way other people read faces. He found it, and what came next didn't just destroy one man's carefully built lie. It set fire to everything. The call came in at 2:47 on a Thursday afternoon. Newey standing in his own driveway, something with his phone. That was the whole report. That all of it. And somehow, before the sun went down, that call cracked open 12 months of lies that had been sitting 42 meters away the entire time. But we'll get to. First, you need to know about Dion Garrett. Dion Garrett did not wave at his neighbors. Not because he was rude. Not because he had something against the people on Crestfield Lane, but because in his experience, waving led to talking. Talking led to questions. And questions, from strangers who had already decided what they thought of you, led to a kind of slow sideways judgment that wore a friendly face and cut just the same. So he kept his head down, did his work, paid his bills on time, kept his yard neat. That was enough. That had to be enough. Harlow Creek was the kind of neighborhood that looked perfect from a distance. Wide streets lined with oak trees that arched overhead like they were trying to hold hands across the road. Houses with front porches that nobody actually sat on. Lawns mowed on Saturdays with the precision of people who had run out of bigger things to worry about. Quiet, deliberately quiet. The kind of quiet where a small mistake echoes. Dion had moved here 10 months ago. Found the rental listing on a Tuesday night while sitting in a motel room outside Cincinnati with 2 suitcases, a laptop bag, and the specific exhaustion that comes not from working too hard, but from fighting too long. The house on Crestfield Lane was a 2-bedroom. Small yard, attached garage. Corner lot meant fewer neighbors with direct sightline to his front. He signed the lease the same week. He did not tell anyone where he was going. That was the point. 12 months before Harlow Creek, Dion had been someone else. Entirely. Not a different person. The same man. But with a job title, a badge, on the 14th floor of Meridian Data Solutions in downtown Columbus. Senior Network Engineer, Dent. 7 years in. The kind of position you don't walk away from. The kind you get walked away from. It happened fast. That was the part that still ambushed him sometimes. In the early mornings before the coffee kicked in. And his brain ran the replay without permission. One week he was sitting in a quarterly review, nodding along, thinking about lunch. The next week, he was sitting across, in a face was arranged in the instant expression pious, upon those when they've already made a decision, but still have to go through the motions of listening. Data breach. Internal. Someone had pulled client files and routed them outside the company's secure network. 53 clients, 18 months of records. The logs, they said, pointed to his credentials, his access codes, his machine, his times. He told it wasn't him. Clearly, calmly. He walked them through every hour of what he had actually done during those windows. None of it matched what they were describing. They thanked him for his time. They walked him to the elevator. Security collected his badge at the lobby. 7 years. Gone before lunch. He didn't fall apart. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. He got angry first. Filed a complaint. With HR, got back a letter written language so careful and so empty it might as well have been generated by a machine. He contacted an employment attorney. Found out that proving wrongful termination when the logs are stacked against you requires time and money when roughly equal and enormous amounts. He had one, not the other, so he left Columbus. Stayed with his cousin in Cincinnati for 6 weeks, which was exactly 5 weeks longer than comfortable for either of them. Picked up 2 freelance contracts through a network security consultancy he'd worked with years before. Rebuilt slowly, carefully. Then he found Harlow Creek and thought, maybe here, maybe quiet. The house Crestfield Lane was nothing special, and that was exactly what he needed. Beige siding, black shutters, a kitchen with good morning light. A back bedroom he converted into an office with a standing desk, 2 monitors, and a network security setup that most small businesses would consider professional grade. Because if there was one thing Dion Garrett understood, after everything that had happened, it was this. You protect your network, or someone else will. He ran diagnostics twice a week, had the router configured to log every device that connected, every IP request, every outbound data packet. Not paranoia. Caution. Those two things are not the same, no matter what people assume when they look at you. His neighbors thought he was odd. He could feel it in the way conversations stopped a half-second too late when he walked to the mailbox. In the way Brenda Kowalski, who lived 4 houses down with a big hydrangea bush and the American flag that never came inside the winter, watched him from her kitchen window without quite hiding that she was watching. He noticed. He always noticed. He just didn't say anything. Because what was he going to say? Brenda Kowalski had lived on Crestfield, Kansas, 19 years. She knew this street the way you know a person you've grown old alongside. She knew which houses had dogs that barked at mail trucks, which ones had sprinklers that ran at 6 in the morning, whose gutters needed cleaning, which family had quietly stopped speaking to each other sometime around the holidays 2 years back. She was not a gossip. She would have said softly if anyone had asked. She was observant. There was a difference. Her husband, Paul, had passed 4 years ago. Cardiac event. Quick, which she had been told was a mercy, though in the months that followed, she wasn't entirely sure she agreed. The house was too big now, too quiet in the wrong ways. Their son lived in Portland and called on Sundays and meant well. Then Joel moved in. Joel was her sister's son, 22 Sarasas, finishing his last semester of a computer science degree at Ohio State. He needed a place to stay while he worked on his senior thesis. Brenda had the room. Patty had asked quietly and carefully enough that saying no felt him puzzle. He was a good kid. She believed that. Quiet at mealtimes. Cleaned up after himself. Kept the door to his room mostly closed, which she understood. Young people needed their space. He spent a lot of time on his computer. Also, understandable. His thesis, he explained, was about security vulnerabilities in home networks, testing how easy it was to access a residential Wi-Fi system without the owning. She had nodded and understood roughly 40% of what he said, but he seemed focused, responsible, working toward something. She trusted that. What she did not trust was Dion Garrett. This was not something she had examined closely. She would have called it instinct. Something about the way he kept to himself so completely, the way he never held eye contact for longer than a second, the way his lights stayed on late and his car sat unmoved for days at a stretch. Normal people, in Brenda's understanding, had a rhythm, a routine that looked like other routines. His didn't look like anything she recognized, and that she felt meant something. The Thursday afternoon everything can change started like every other day that week. Dion had been on a call with a client here in Center since 10 in the morning, a mid-sized logistics company that brought him in to audit their internal network after a vendor got hit with ransomware. Dull work, useful work, the kind he was good at. By 2:30, he was done. He made coffee, opened his secondary monitor, ran his weekly check on the home network, and that's when he saw it. 7, right there in the device list, connected, active, drawing, bandit for a moment, scrolled the rest of the list. His phone, his laptop, 2 desktop machines, smart TV, printer, and then HCK No 7. He didn't recognize it. The naming convention was wrong. Not random, like a device that hadn't been properly configured. The name had structure, a prefix, like someone had deliberately labeled it. He pulled up the device details, MAC address he didn't recognize, signal strength strong, and the detail that made him set his coffee mug down slowly. It had been connected in weeks. He had been running diagnostics twice a week for 10 months and had never flagged this device, which meant one of two things. Either his scan configuration had a gap he didn't know about, or someone had built this thing specifically to stay below the detection threshold of residential-grade security tools. Both options were worse than each other. He opened the traffic logs. The device wasn't just sitting there. Every 4 hours, give or take, it sent out a burst of data. Small packets, routed outbound through his connection. The destination IP was masked behind a relay, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone who had spent years reading exactly this kind of thing. This wasn't someone watching Netflix on his bandwidth. This was a collection device, built to gather data and push it out on a schedule. Dion sat very still. Then he fixed up his phone and went outside. He needed stronger signals to run the trace properly. The interior walls created dead zones he'd never fully resolved. So he went the front door, stood in the driveway just left of his car, and opened the diagnostic app he used for field work. Thursday afternoon, quiet street, nobody around. Or so he thought. He was focused on the screen, watching the trace route, pulling data from the router remotely and running it against a pattern database he kept updated. 12 minutes, maybe a little more. He didn't notice Brenda Kowalski standing at her kitchen window. She noticed him. She had washing the lunch dishes and looked up, and there he was, standing in his driveway, yes, staring at moving quickly across the screen, looking up occasionally. She watched for 3 minutes. Still focused. Still looked. Still doing it. It was doing. What? Said what exactly? But the feeling was immediate. A man in his driveway on a Thursday afternoon, tapping urgently at his phone, checking whether anyone was watching. It looked like something. She dried her hands, picked up her phone, dialed. She told the dispatcher she wanted to report suspicious behavior, that her neighbor was outside doing something that didn't look right, that he'd been there a while and she didn't know him well. The dispatcher asked if she had seen any weapons. No. Had she witnessed a crime? Well, not exactly. Was there an immediate threat she could describe? She paused. It just doesn't look right, she said. The dispatcher said send someone to check. Deacon was almost finished when he heard the cruiser. He looked up, watched it slow, watched it stop in front of his house. 2 officers stepped out. The first was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned a long time ago not to arrive anywhere fast. Late 40s, dark skin, close-cropped gray at his temples, eyes that moved before the rest of him did. Detective Walt Greer, though Dion didn't know his name yet. The second was a woman, compact, focused. Officer Lynn Farrow, already scanning the front of the house before her feet hit the pavement. The look of someone cataloging, not accusing. Dion stayed where he was, phone in hand, didn't move toward them, didn't move away, because he knew how this went. He had learned, across the whole of his adult life, what happened when a black man moved unexpectedly toward law enforcement in a quiet suburban neighborhood. So he stood still, kept his hands visible, made his face neutral, not friendly, not challenging, not anything that could be misread, just still. Sir, Greer's voice was even. He stopped about 10 feet out, hands relaxed at his sides. Got a call about some activity in the area. Mind telling me what you're doing? Dion looked at him, looked back. I'm standing in my driveway, he said. Pause, changing my Wi-Fi password. Greer's expression didn't move. You live here, and there it was. The question that, no matter how many times it came, since still landed in the same place. I've 10 months, Dion said. 10 months. Farrow was writing in a small notebook. Didn't look up. Greer nodded slowly. Anyone else home? No ID knew? Dion reached carefully into his back pocket, produced his wallet, handed over his driver's license with 2 fingers. The address matched. Greer handed it back. Can I ask what the nature of the call was? Dion said. Neighbor reported something that looked off. Dion turned his head slightly. And there she was, Brenda Kowalski, standing on her front porch now, not even pretending otherwise, arms folded, watching everything with the focused attention of someone who had paid good money for a front row seat. Something moved through his chest. Tight and familiar, he let it pass. I found an unauthorized device on my home network, he said, voice steady. I came outside to run a signal trace. Better line of sight to the router. Greer was quiet for a moment. What kind of device? That's what I'm figuring out. From across the yard, Brenda's voice cut through. He's always doing something like this. She said it like she was contributing useful information. Always outside with his phone, looking around. I didn't know what he was up to. Dion turned to look at her. He held his expression still, then turned back to Greer. You want to cease the router logs? He said. Because I think you probably should. They went inside. Dion's house was clean the way of someone who needed their environment to make sense because enough other things didn't. Books on shelves organized by subject. Cables managed with zip ties behind the desk. A coffee mug rinsed and upside down by the sink. Greer stood near the dining table. Farrow positioned herself by the door. Standard procedure. 2 officers in a civilian's home. One watches the room. Dion opened his laptop, pulled up the router management interface, turned the screen toward. There, HCG 70, not mine. Greer leaned in, looking without touching. You sure it's not one of your own devices set up under a name? I named every device on this network myself. I don't use the naming convention. The MAC address doesn't anything I own. He clicked to the traffic logs, but that's not the part that worried me. Greer looked at the outbound data patterns, the regular intervals, the masked relay. He went quiet. What am I looking at? Something's been sitting on my network for 9 weeks, Dion said, pushing data out every 4 hours. Farrow had moved closer, looking over Greer's shoulder. Her expression had shifted in a way that was difficult to name but easy to read if you looked to pay attention. What kind of data? She said. I don't know yet. I was in the middle of figuring that out when your cruiser pulled up. Greer straightened. He looked at Dion with specific attention of someone of so down whether they're bringing the told truth. Dion looked back, because he was. Can you go deeper? Greer said, into what it's actually accessing. Yeah, give me a few minutes. Dion sat at the desk, pulled up a secondary diagnostic tool, started tracing the node's activity backward through the log history, what it had touched, what it had queried, what had been within its reach. The room was quiet except for keyboard. Then Dion stopped, his fingers hovered. Greer noticed the change before Dion said anything. What? Not a question, an instruction. Dion turned the laptop around slowly. 2 columns of data on the screen. On the left, MAC addresses of devices H07s had accessed. On the right, what those devices were. Smart TVs, laptops, security cameras. It's been pulling feeds, Dion said, from the security cameras inside this house. Live feeds accessed remotely. Farrow looked at Greer. Greer looked at the screen. Brenda Kosolski, who had let herself in the front door, because nobody had thought to stop her, stood all the way up and said nothing. Just stood there, very, very still. The weight of what on was screen arrived in the room quietly. Not with noise or panic, just a slow shift in what everyone understood to be true. Greer's hand went briefly toward his radio, a reflex, then stopped.
Is it just your cameras? Dion was already typing. This device has been using my network as a relay point. If it can reach my cameras, it may be reaching outward. Networks nearby, other houses.
Possibly. The words sat there between them. Brenda made a sound, not quite a word, just his breath with something inside it. He kept his focus on the screen, because here was the thing pulling at the back of his mind, quiet and persistent, like a signal, just below the frequency he could fully tune to. He had seen this before. Not this house, this street, this device, but the behavior, the architecture of it. The way the node had embedded itself without appearing in standard scans. A structure, the collections schedule. He had seen it in log files from a server at Meridian Data Solutions 12 months ago, right before everything collapsed. He didn't say that yet. He kept tracing, because first he needed to know how far this went, and then he would figure out why it felt like a face he recognized. The data came back in pieces, first his cameras, then the access patterns reaching outward, then something that made him pull the laptop back an inch and look at the screen for 3 full seconds before he spoke. Farrow, Greer said, reading whatever was happening in the posture of the man at the keyboard. I see it, Farrow said, from over Dion's shoulder. What? Brenda said, from the hallway. Dion looked at Greer. It's not just my network, he said. The node been using next in my connection as a jump point, reaching outward, accessing other routers on this street. Greer's jaw tightened, just slightly. How many? Dion scrolled through the data. Counted carefully, at least 5 houses, he said. Possibly 6. Some signals are faint. Could be more, I can't clearly read from here. And the cameras. Same thing. Any house with a security camera connected to a home network that wasn't properly hardened. He paused. Which is most houses. Brenda stepped into the room. Are you saying someone has been watching people's homes? Dion looked at her. He could have said something pointed. She had handed him that opening on a clean plate. He looked at her. For 1 moment this once 1 month. Supplements Winfo, 2 months and Kunsen called the police because he was standing in his own driveway. Yes, he said. That's what I'm saying. Her face moved through disbelief, then confusion, then something slower and more uncomfortable, that single clean name. Which houses? Greer said. Dion turned the screen toward him. Greer leaned in. Read down the list of IP addresses. Cross-referenced with the network map Dion pulled up in the next window, showing signal strength proximity. He stopped at one address, looked up, looked at Brenda. Ma'am. Greer's voice was careful. Is your home network connected to a security? Brenda blinked. Yeah, I have. In the kitchen, my son's setups. And Brenda's. And I think they might winning, yeah. She stopped. In the bedroom? Farrow said, very quietly. Dion then watched her fakes go through the specific vertigo of understanding that something you thought was protecting you had been then you the thing used. A gut feeling. More than she would ever know. He looked back at his screen. He should have felt something like satisfaction. The woman who had watched him through her kitchen window and called the police on him because he was standing in his own driveway was now learning that the actual danger had been inside her own walls. He didn't feel satisfaction. He felt tired. And underneath the tired, something else. Something he had been pushing to the side of his mind since the first moment he saw the node architecture and the relay pattern and the 4-hour collections cycle. He'd seen this before. The question was not how. The how was clear enough. The question was who, and whether the persons responsible had been watching this address, specifically this house, or whether they had been watching him. That was the question he wasn't ready to say out loud, not because he didn't suspect the answer, because if he was right, saying it made it real. And if it was real, it meant that the motel, the moat room in Cincinnati, the long drive to Harlow Creek, the careful, quiet life he had rebuilt one piece at a time. None of it had put any actual distance between him and what happened at Marina. It meant they had followed him. It meant they had never stopped. Greer was on the radio now, requesting support. Dion heard the word cybercrime and the address and something about multiple residential systems compromised. Farrow was taking photos of his screen. Brenda was sitting in one of his dining chairs, hands folded in her lap, looking like a woman who had triggered a fire alarm and discovered smoke was coming from her own walls. Dion looked at his screen, looked at the node, looked at the collection pattern. Same architecture he had seen at Meridian, same related signature, same 4-hour schedule. He spent 10 months building a life around being careful, around protecting his network, around not trusting systems he hadn't personally verified. And someone had gotten in anyway. He thought they had. He was almost certain he knew who. He just needed Greer to still. Greer was looking at him. The radio call was done. The room at Hallott's back, and to Kawhi said, Greer said, not an accusation, just reading the room accurately. Dion met his eyes. I've seen this kind of node architecture before, he said. The collection interval, the relay method, the way it masks itself from standard scans. He looked at. I've seen all of it, but not here. Not. Dion took a breath. Where I used to work, he said, 12 months ago. So senior network engineer at Meridian Data Solutions in Columbus. There was a breach. Internal. Someone pulled client files and routed them out of the secure network. He looked at Greer directly. The device signature in the internal logs looked exactly like this. Exactly. Close enough that I don't think it's a coincidence. And what happened to you at Meridian? Dion held the eye contact. The logs pointed to my credentials, he said. My machine. My access codes. He let Greer do the math. Greer looked at the screen, then at Dion, then back at the screen. The kind of look that meant he was running the sequence, the breach, the termination, the move to Harlow Creek, the device on the network 9 weeks after arrival. So someone set you up, Dion said. Ian, 9 weeks after I arrived. This, he gestured at the laptop, appeared in my net. He means whoever did it at Meridian knew where I went, Dion said. 8 people of the settled in, said. The dining room was very quiet. Greer pulled out a notebook, small, worn at the corners, old school. He clicked his pen. Tell me everything about Meridian, he said. Start from the beginning. And Dion Tasha exhaled all the way down. For the first time in 12 months, he exhaled all the way down because someone was finally listening. Not just hearing, listening, with a pen in hand and time set aside, and the specific posture of a man who understood that the first version of a story is rarely the true one. Dion pulled his chair closer to the desk, and he started talking. The cybercrime unit arrived 40 minutes later. 2 of them, man and a woman, both in plain clothes, was both carrying laptop bags with the focused quid of people who had done this many times and understood that speed without accuracy was just a way to get it wrong. They introduced themselves at the door, shook hands briefly, and immediately turned their attention to the router, like it was the only thing in the room worth looking at. Which, at that moment, it was. Greer stepped back. Let them work. Farrow stayed near the window. Dion sat at his own desk, in his own house, watching strangers take over his network, and tried to locate the line between relieved and invaded. It was a narrow margin, closer than he expected. Brenda was still in the dining chair. She hadn't moved in 40 minutes, hands folded in her lap, eyes moving around the room without settling anywhere for long. She had the look of someone who had arrived at a destination she hadn't planned to be at, and was now trying to figure out whether she was a guest or a witness or something else entirely. Nobody had asked her to leave. Nobody had asked her to stay. She had simply remained, the way certain facts remain after you've tried to argue where you made and one in the room had quietly accepted her presence because addressing it would have taken energy that belonged somewhere else. Dion noticed looking at him twice. He looked away first, both times. Not because her gaze made him uncomfortable, because he was tired of performing own composure for an audience that had already written its review. The lead tech from Cybercrime set a chair next to Dion's desk without asking and opened his own machine. His name was Aldridge, the kind of face that was difficult to age and impossible to read, which Dion suspected was either a professional habit or a personality trait that had become one over time. Walk me through how you found it, Aldridge said. Dino, tempted fleet. The anomaly. Trap blocks. Outbound weeks of data, passioning out on a 4-hour schedule to a mass destination list without interrupting. The second tech, a woman named Solis, who had introduced herself and then barely spoken since, was running something on the far side of the room with a portable network scanner. She moved quietly, methodically, the kind of focus that didn't need an audience. Your scan configuration, Aldridge said when Dion finished. You said it runs twice a week, Wednesday mornings and Saturday evenings. And it never flagged the device. Not until today, which means either I had a detection gap I didn't know about, or this thing was built specifically to stay below the threshold of residential-grade security tools. But Aldridge looked at him. You'd know the difference between an amateur hiding a device and someone who understands network architecture. Yes, this one. Dion looked at the screen. This is not an amateur. Aldridge filed that away without commenting on it. The relay signature. You said you'd seen something similar before. At my last employer, Meridian Data Solutions, Columbus. Internal breach about 12 months ago. DF called this the lost, the same architecture, same relay method I fly collection. Same collection schedules. History of our There it was. Dion had been waiting for that question since Greer called for backup. He had known it was coming the way you know. An uncomfortable chair is going to start hurting before you've been in it long enough to feel it. I was the one they blamed, he said. And then fired. Silence. But you're saying you didn't do it. I'm saying tools. In this neighborhood. He held Aldridge's gaze. You can decide what that means. Aldridge looked at his own screen for a moment. Then, okay, let's keep going. Farrow had moved to the dining table with her own laptop. She was running the IP cross-reference. Dion started head off before the officers arrived, taking it further with tools that reached into places his setup couldn't. 5 confirmed households, she said. Possibly 6. There's a 6th signal that keeps dropping in and out. Could be at the edge of the relay range. Greer was near the window. He had barely shifted position in the last hour, just stood there watching the room and the street outside with the patience of a man who had learned that standing still was sometimes the most useful thing you could do. Cameras in all 5, he said. 4 confirmed. The 5th house was accessed, but the camera traffic is minimal. Either no active system or poor signal angle. She paused, scrolling. The 4 with active feeds show repeated access over the past What kind of access? Farrow looked up. Her interior chambers. How interior? Her expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. Living rooms, kitchens. A pause says, bedrooms. From the dining chair, Brenda said, oh God, quietly, to no one in particular. Like something she hadn't meant to say out loud. Greer turned to her slowly. Your home network, same provider as this street? Brenda nodded. Paul set it all up years ago. I haven't touched it since. And the camera your son installed after the break-in. It connects to the network, yes. He set it up so I could check it on my phone. She paused. He said it would feel safe at night. Greer looked at Farrow. Farrow was already pulling up the address. She found it. She looked at her screen for 2 full seconds without speaking, which was long enough. Your address is on the list, she said to Brenda. She said it directly without building up to it. Just set it down like a fact that needed to be dealt with before anything else could happen. Brenda blinked. House? House, yes. My cameras, yes. Brenda's hands, which had been folded neatly in her lap for the past hour, came apart. She looked at them as if she wasn't sure what they were supposed to do. The one in the bedroom, she said. Her voice had gone small. The one my son added. Because I told him I was nervous being alone at night. She stopped. He said it'd make me feel safe. Nobody answered that, because there was no answer that helped. Dion kept his eyes on his screen. He was not going to look at her face right now. Not at the specific horror of understanding that the thing meant to protect you was the thing that had been turned against you. He understood that feeling in ways she couldn't know, in ways he was not going to explain tonight. Farrow flagged the footage timestamp logs for Aldridge and kept pulling data. Solis had moved to the center of the room with her portable scanner, mapping the signal radius, trying to locate where the relay was originating from before it jumped to Dion's connection. Set up like this needs a physical anchor, Solis said. Mostly to Aldridge, but loud enough that everyone could hear. Something plugged in. Something maintaining a stable handshake with the whole network inside a house, Farrow said. Within signal range of this address, 50 meters, give or take, depending on the antenna. She checked the scanner readout. Could be a dedicated device. Could be software running on hardware someone already had in place. Greer straightened. So we're something physically located close to this house, or being broadcast from a device inside one of these houses. Solis looked at the readout again. Someone nearby. Someone close enough to maintain a consistent signal over 9 weeks. Close. Nearby. This street. Nobody said what that meant. They did need to. Dean had not planned to do anything other than answer questions and let the professionals work. That had been the plan. He was cooperative. He's cooperative, which was one of the many things that had not helped at Meridian and was not going to stop him now. But he knew networks, had spent 15 years learning to read them the way other people read faces, the rhythms, the CG smooth definitions that meant something was off before he could name what in something was pulling at him. The signal strength on HCK Narrow 7 had never dropped below a certain floor in the entire 9-week log. Not during high traffic periods, when weaker connections got pushed out. Not during the 2 days last month when he'd run heavy diagnostic loads. The broadcast source, consistent. Like something that didn't move and didn't need to. He pulled up the signal history graph, laid it over his own network traffic timeline. The node signal peaked every night between 10 and 7 in the morning. His own activity dropped in that window. The relay had the cleanest possible outbound path during those hours. Whoever set this up knew his routine, or lived close enough to observe it. He pulled up the field-grade network scanner app on his laptop, the design for commercial spaces and corporate campuses. Not ideal for residential triangulation, but the principal transfer. He ran it 3 times, adjusting the antenna booster from his kit bag between each pass. The triangulation result pointed east-northeast. He pulled up a satellite map, traced the angle, cross-referenced signal strength with distance, east-northeast, approximately 42 meters. He had walked past that address 400 times without thinking about it. The house with the big hydrangea bush, the American flag that never came inside. He sat back in his chair. He turned and looked at Brenda Kowalski, who was still in his dining chair, staring at the floor, hands apart in her lap. He looked back at his screen. Then Detective Greer looked at him. Dion turned the laptop so to see the triangulation result, the map, the signal line, the address at the end of it. Greer leaned in. Read it. Traced the line with his eyes. He was quiet for a moment. The ET stood up straight, slowly. "Ma'am, to go to your couch," he said. She didn't argue. That was the thing Dean noticed, he said. No pushback, no why, or that's impossible. Or there must be a mistake. She just stood up, the slow, careful movement of someone who had heard something she wasn't ready for, and had known somehow it was coming, and reached for her purse by the door. Dion moved to stand. "You stay here," Greer tasked. Not done, stopped. Sat. Backed out down, watched them walk out the front door. Greer and Farrow and Brenda. Solis stayed behind with Aldridge, still running traces, still building the picture. Dion turned back to his screens, sat alone in his own living room, and tried not to think about a Tuesday afternoon in Columbus 12 months ago when 2 people from legal had walked him to an elevator and badge had been collected at the lobby, and he had stood on the sidewalk with a laptop bag on his shoulder and nowhere specific to be. He had been invisible that day, not metaphorically, but simply invisible. Like he could erase the situation, and the situation would simply close over the space where he had been, like water over a stone. He looked at his hands. He was still here. That had to count for something. Brenda's house was 7 minutes on foot. Greer did not rush her. He matched her pace, hands in his jacket pockets. Farrow walked one step, and to the left, close enough to be present and far enough to give the woman space to be in whatever this was. The street was quiet. Late afternoon in October, the light going long and thin, stretching shadows ahead of them like something impatient. Brenda had not spoken since they left Dion's house. Greer let her have the silence. 22 years of doing this work had taught him that silence before a door was information. It told you what a person was carrying, what they were preparing themselves to find. Brenda was preparing for something she didn't want to discover. He recognized that. She unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house inside was warm, neat in the specific way of someone who had spent decades maintaining a home for reasons that became habit after the reasons themselves were gone. A photo of two people on a boat, a man with a wedding ring visible, a moment from before Portland, before the phone calls on Sunday. A school picture of a boy frozen at 10 years old on the side table. Greer looked around without touching anything. Your nephew. He Joel? Is he home? Brenda looked at the stairs. He's usually in his room in the afternoons, working on his thesis. Did he know you went over to the neighbor's house? She shook her head. I just walked over when I saw the police car. I didn't think anything was going to. She stopped, didn't finish. Greer looked at Farrow. Farrow was already looking at the stairs. Let's go up, he said. Joel Kowalski's door was closed. No music, no movement, no sound on. No. Greer knocked 3 times, solid, silence. Then a chair scraping back, one footstep, a pause. The door opened. Joel Kowalski was 22 years old and looked it in the way that matters, which is to say he looked young enough to still believe that the distance between his decision and its consequences was longer than it actually was. Tall, slightly built, wearing a gray hoodie that had been through too many washes. Upon the point of intention and not yet into style that moved immediately to Greer, then to Farrow, then to Brenda. Quick! Assessing. Not surprised. That was the first thing Greer noticed. A 22-year-old opening his bedroom door to find 2 plainclothes officers was not surprised. Concerned, careful, calculating the distance between what he knew and what they might know, but not surprised. Hey, Aunt Bren. His voice was steady, slightly tootsy. What's going on? We'd like to talk to you. Greer said, sure. Joel didn't move back from the doorframe. About what? Your thesis project. Something moved through his face, fast enough that it was almost not there. My thesis, he said. Network security vulnerabilities in residential settings, Greer said. That's what you told your aunt. Yeah, his jaw was set in a way that was trying to look casual. What about it? We've been looking at a network anomaly on this street, Farrow said. Her voice was easy, conversational. The tone of someone who had all the time in the world and wasn't in any hurry to use it. A device embedded in a neighbor's router, running a collection and relay operation. Joel said nothing. The signal triangulates back to this address, she continued. This floor, roughly speaking. Silence. Brenda put one hand on the wall beside her, lightly, like she needed something to lean against without wanting to look like she needed it. Joel looked at his aunt then. At Greer, he stepped back from the door. Come in, he said. The room told a story before anyone spoke. 2 monitors on a desk, made from a door blank, laid across a pair of sawhorses. 3 external hard drives lined up and labeled into small, neat print. A power strip running 7 devices. A whiteboard on the wall covered in network arrows notation. A mini fridge humming quietly in the corner. LED strip is along the ceiling baseboard set to deep blue. And on the main monitor, a screen that had been minimized in the last 40 seconds. The taskbar at the bottom, showing the ghosts of several closed windows. Farrow saw it, said nothing. Joel sat on the edge of his bed, hands on his knees, face arranged into something cooperative that was landing closer to controlled. Walk us through the thesis project, Greer said. I'm studying residential network vulnerabilities, Joel said. The words had shape to them. Not rehearsed exactly, but considered, like he had run through this explanation before in his head, just in case. Most people don't change default router credentials. Most home security cameras have documented vulnerabilities. I've been mapping what an attacker could theoretically access in a typical suburban neighborhood. He paused. For my senior thesis in computer science. Greer nodded slowly. And your faculty supervisor is aware of this work. A pause, half a second. He knows the general scope, but not the specifics. Another pause, shorter. Like Joel had noticed the first one's a tell and was trying to correct. It's still in the data collection phase, he said. Farrow had moved to the desk. She wasn't touching anything, but she was reading the monitor, the taskbar. The corner of a full Explorer window Joel hadn't closed fast enough. She stopped singing in the bottom right of the screen. She looked at Greer. 2 seconds, silent. Greer looked back. The exchange said, "I found something." Joel, his voice had dropped a register, still even, but the question marks were gone. "We need to look at your laptop." Joel's hands tightened on his knee. "You don't have a warrant." "No," Greer said. "We don't. And we can get one. We can come back in 3 hours with a warrant and a forensic team, and that's a different conversation entirely." He paused. "Or you show us what's on that machine right now, and we talk about how this actually started, and you have a chance to explain your side before this becomes something you can't navigate your way out of." The room was very quiet. Joel looked at his aunt standing in the doorway. Brenda was looking at her nephew the way you look at something familiar that you are being asked to look at again, not with anger yet, with the specific disorientation of someone whose understanding of a thing has just been quietly rearranged. Joel looked at the floor, then at his laptop. Then he opened it. Farrow took it carefully. Opened the File Explorer. The folder structure was extensive, color-coded, organized with the meticulous of somewhat categories and subcategories, and had built this architecture deliberately over time. The top-level folders were labeled by address, street name, house numbers, Crestfield Lane, numbered 1 through 12. She opened the folder for Dion's address first. Inside, subfolders organized by rooms, ganks, cameras, tanks, babes, timestamps running daily. 9 weeks of material. She opened the folder for Brenda's address. Same structure. She opened a thumbnail. Previews loaded. She closed the laptop. She looked at Greer. Her expression didn't change, but the quality of her stillness did. The kind of still that means a person is deciding very carefully what to do with what they've just seen. "Joel," Greer said, quietly now. "The volume that meant this was enough not to need. How many addresses are in that folder structure?" Joel stared at the floor. "Joel, 11, he said. The word arrived in the room and stayed there. Brenda made a sound, not a word, not a cry. The sound a person makes when understanding lands in the body before the mind has caught up. 11 households, Farrow said. "Some of them I barely got anything from," Joel said quickly. "The signal was weak or the angle was bad. It wasn't all." He stopped. "It wasn't uniform, but 11 households," Greer said. "People who had no idea they were being recorded." Joel said nothing. "Your aunt," Greer said. "Her bedroom." Joel's face did something complicated and rapid that he shut down before it resolved. "I didn't spend a lot of time on her feeds," he said. Brenda walked out of the room. She didn't run. She just turned and walked out, footsteps going down the hall at a measure's pace, and then the sound stopped somewhere near the top of the stairs. Joel watched her go, and for the first time since they'd walked in, he looked like what he actually was. A 22-year-old sitting on the edge of a bed who had made a series of choices and kept making them past the point where stopping was easy and was now sitting in the accumulated weight of those choices with nowhere to set them down. "It started as a research project," he said. His voice had lost the practiced shape. "I wanted to see if I could actually do it. The literature says residential networks are almost universally underprepared. I wanted to test that. And then," Farrow said. Joel was quiet for a moment. "And then I could," he said. "Just that. And then I could." 3 words that explained nothing and somehow explained everything about how a person crosses a line they told themselves they were only approaching. Greer stepped out to call it in. Farrow stayed with Joel. Dean arrived 4 minutes later. Nobody had specifically told him to stay at his house. He had waited what felt like a reasonable amount of time, which turned out to be 11 minutes. Small war. Because the owner told, because the alternative was sitting in his dining room to Aldridge. Solace talked to each other in the short rand of people who had worked together long enough to stop using full sentences. He came in through the front door that Brenda had left unlocked, Brenda sitting at the bottom of the stairs, not crying. Past that somehow, into a stillness that was quieter than crying. He didn't stop. He went up, found Greer in the hallway outside Joel's room. Greer looked at him, took in his presence without commenting on it. 11 houses, he said. Dion absorbed that. The signal came from in here. We'll confirm the physical device, but yes, based on the laptop, Greer paused. It's organized, Garrett, not casual, not curiosity, systematic. Dion leaned against the wall, looked at the door to Joel's room. He said it started as research, Greer continued. It did. Dion said. Someone pointed him here. Someone gave him a reason to set up on this specific street. He kept his voice low. Architecture of that node is not something a CISA thesis students built scratch projects. It's too clean, too deliberate. He had help or instructions, or both. Greer was quiet. Someone told him to watch me specifically, Dion said. Someone knew I was going to be on this street and made sure there was infrastructure in place before I arrived. You keep coming back to Meridian because everything keeps pointing there. Greer looked at the closed door, then back at Dion. We need to talk to him about where the data was going, he said. They went in. Farrow had already started on it. She had pulled up the outbound to traffic from Joel's setup on her own device, mapped the relay chain, the same masked VPN exit that Dion had identified from his end. But Farrow had tools that could go further. 2 VPN layers. But the underlying traffic has a timing signature. She looked at Aldridge, who had come over from Dion's house, while Greer was in the hall. The packets are being shaped deliberately to look like standard residential browsing. Aldridge looked at the readout. That's not configured in an afternoon. No, Farrow said. They both looked at Joel. Joel was looking at the floor. He had been looking at the floor for most of the last 20 minutes. The floor of his own bedroom had become the safest available surface. Who built the relay? Farrow said. Joel didn't. Joel. Greer's voice was patient. Who has nowhere else to be and understands that the person across from him doesn't either. The laptop, the footage, the node architecture. 11 households. That's enough for charges right now. Unauthorized access to a computer network. Unlawful surveillance. He let that settle. But there's a question that matters a great deal for what happens next. Whether you designed this yourself or whether someone told what to build and where to put it. Joel looked up. The redness at the edges of his eyes had spread. I didn't design the relay, he said. Who did? Silence. Joel. Farrow's voice was quieter than Greer's, with an edge Greer's didn't have. There's a folder on your laptop with 9 weeks of footage from one address, just one, or 3 as differently suffered as more. Better camera angles, higher resolution settings. She let that sit. That's the house directly across the street. Everyone in the room understood which house she meant. Joel looked at Dion for the first time since they'd walked in, held it for half a second, then looked away. The folder for that address starts from your first week here, Farrow continued, her eyes on Joel. Before you'd set up the full network across the street. She has access to any of the other 11 houses. She paused, which means that specific address was the starting point, the reason for the setup. Everything else came after. The room was very quiet. Dion was looking at Joel, not with anger, with something more focused, the cold attention of a man who has been living inside a mystery for 12 months and is watching the slices of it arrange themselves into a shape he already suspected. Someone told you to watch me, Dion said. Joel pressed his hands flat against his thighs. Someone told you to set up on this street, Dion said. At your aunt's house, because it was close enough, because the angle was right, because she would let you move in and not ask too many questions. His voice was completely even, not loud, just clear, and that someone gave you a story to make it feel acceptable, a former employee, an NDA violation, something that sounded like a legitimate reason. Joel's hands were shaking slightly. I didn't know it would go this far, he said. That's not what I asked. Joel looked at him, and then quietly, with the specifics of someone putting something heavy down on a floor. There was an account, he said, online, found me through a security research forum. Said they needed someone to run a network audit on a residential block for a private security firm. Said the homeowner had given consent. He stopped. Said the priority was one specific address, that there was a former employee who had violated an NDA, that they needed documentation of his remote work activity for a legal case. The temperature in the room changed. Dion's face did not move. A former employee, Greer said, and you believe them. And Joel looked at his hands, at the shaking he was trying to stop and couldn't quite. They paid me $400 up front, he said. Nobody spoke. The account, Farrow said. The one that contacted you. Do you still have the messages? Joel looked at his second monitor. Yeah, he said. They're encrypted, but I have them. Farrow looked at Aldridge. Aldridge was already opening his kit. It took 40 minutes in which Greer stood in the corner and said almost nothing. in which Pharaoh worked through the folder structure on Joel's laptop with the systematic attention of someone constructing something that would need to hold up later, in which Joel sat on his bed and stared at the floor and did not ask for a lawyer, which Greer noticed and understood meant Joel had decided that the only available move was cooperation. Dion had moved to the hallway again. He leaned against the wall and listened to the sounds of the house. Brenda, somewhere below. The sound of a chair. Water running briefly. The particular sounds of a woman doing small things because standings left too much room for everything to arrive at once. He understood that. He had spent 12 months doing exactly the same thing. Keep moving. Fill the hours. Don't sit with it too long, or it settles into weight. He looked at the ceiling, thought about Clint Adler, not in the way he usually thought about him, which was with the specific weariness of one who has gone seen enough times that the anger has worn smooth. He thought about him with a new clarity. The coffee Adler had brought that Tuesday morning, the way he'd said, "You're going to be fine, man. You know how these things go." The way he'd been in the lobby when Dion came back down. The way his face had arranged itself into rolling on Dion's behalf. I can't believe they did that. He had believed him. That was the part that still sat wrong. Not the firing, not the accusation, the belief. The trust he had placed in a man who had been looking him in the eye while doing something that had cost Dion everything. He had believed him. From Joel's room came Aldridge's voice, low and even. Got it. Dion pushed off the wall and walked back in. The message archive was on Aldridge's screen, arranged chronologically. The earliest Net's message was dated 9.5 months ago, before Dion had signed the lease on this house, before he had found the listing, before the motel room in Cincinnati, before he had decided to come to Harlow Creek at all, which meant someone had been positioning pieces before Dion knew where he was going. Greer read the first message, then the second. Then he looked up at Dion with an expression that was careful in the way of a man who understood the weight of what he was about to say. "You mentioned a colleague at Meridian," he said. "Someone you were close to." Dion's chest went tight. Greer looked at the screen, then at Dion. "The account that contacted Joel," he said. "The messages, the payment instructions, the technical specifications for the node build." He turned the laptop toward Dion. Aldridge's decryption had a partial on the account email. On the screen, the message archive. And at the top of a payment confirmation, a partially unmasked email. A domain name. A username prefix. C. Adler. Bill Dion stood. He looked at the screen for a long time, not because he was surprised, because he had known. Had known since the first moment he looked at the node architect and felt recognition move through him like cold water. He had known at some level that this was where the trail led. Had been pushing Kent Conk's hollowed Serata for 2 hours because and seeing different things, and he had needed the seeing to be real before he let himself fully arrive at it. He was seeing it now. "That's him," he said. His voice was steady, which was the most unsettling thing about it. Greer watched him. "Clint Adler," Dion said again, saying the name twice if the first time had only partially made it real. "He built the breach Meridian, blamed it on me, got me fired." He stopped, breathed, and then when I left. When I moved here, when I found this house on a Tuesday night in a motel room and signed the lease because the corner lot meant fewer sight lines, and I thought maybe here I could just legwork. Yeah, and be left alone. He looked at the screen. He followed me. Paid a kid to watch me in the one place I thought I was actually starting over. He looked at Joel, who was looking at the floor. "He told you I violated an NDA, said." Joel said nothing. Nothing. "He gave you to tell yourself this was legitimate. And you took $400, and you set up at your aunt's house, and you watched me sleep and exists in the one place I thought was mine." Dion's didn't voice, didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't do anything that would give someone a reason to dismiss what he was saying. "And you kept going for 9 weeks. Joel's hands pressed flat against his thighs. "I didn't know it was going to." "You knew it wasn't right," Dion said. "You knew from the first week." Joel had no answer for that, because there wasn't one. Dion looked at him for one more moment, then he walked out into the hallway. He didn't slam the door, didn't need to. He stood in the narrow hallway with the carpet runner and the framed cross storage, and the stillness of a house that had just had something trues inside it. Below, the sounds of Brendan's kitchen, a kettle, a chair scraping back. He stood there. He had a name now. He had the messages. He had the payment records. He had the architecture of the thing that had been built around him like a net, and the hand that had thrown it when 9 weeks of evidence that it had been deliberate and staged and personal. It wasn't over. He understood that. There was still the legal process, still the expensive work of making institutions acknowledge what had been done. Still Adler, somewhere in Columbus, not knowing that the net he'd built had just been found by the person it was built around. But tonight Dion had an aim, and that was more than he'd had that morning, when he walked out the door to reset his Wi-Fi and stood in his own driveway and let himself be watched. He breathed in, out, and waited for what came next. The hallway outside Joel's room was narrow, just wide enough for one person to stand without touching both. A strip of carpet runner, floral pattern, the kind that had been there long enough to stop being a choice and become just the floor. Framed cross-stitch near the bathroom door that said something about home and blessings in thread color that had faded to something softer than their original intention. Dion stood there. He wasn't counting time. He wasn't thinking about next steps or legal strategy or what Greer was going to say when he came back out of that room. He was just standing in a narrow hallway in a house that wasn't his, listening to the particular silence of a situation that had said everything it needed to say, and was now waiting for the people inside it to catch up. His phone showed 6:48 p.m. He had walked out his front door at 2:51 to run a signal trace, less than 4 hours. 4 hours between standing in his own driveway being watched through a kitchen window and here in the house of the woman who had made that call. The name of the man responsible sitting in an encrypted message archive 40 feet away. Clint Adler. He said it in his head once more, not to make it hurt. I was past the part where the name needed. He said it so he'd take the diagnosis out loud for the first time, just to hear how it fits in the air, to confirm that the word is real and belongs to the thing you've been carrying. It fit. It was real. Greer appeared in the doorway. He looked at Dion the way he'd been looking at him all evening, with the specific attention of who was tracking not just what was being said, but what was being held back, reading the gaps. "You okay?" he said. Dion considered the question. "I'm functional," he said. Greer accepted that. He had the quality rare in Dion's experience of not needing people to be confined when they weren't. "Aldridge is pulling the full account history," Greer said. "Payment records, the full message thread, the technical specifications Adler sent Joel for the note build. Everything." He paused. "It's going to take a few hours to package it properly for the DA. How solid is it?" "Solid enough that I'm comfortable making a call tonight." Dion nodded. "To Columbus, to the Columbus field office, because this crosses jurisdictions. The surveillance charges are called local, but fraud. And the original Meridian client data connects back to Adler. The theft of trade secrets, that's federal." Dion leaned against the wall. The wallpaper behind him was a faded yellow stripe. Paul Kowalski's choice, probably, or Brenda's, from 9 years ago when his house was a different kind of house. 53 clients, he said, from the Meridian breach. 18 months of records, which means this isn't just your wrongful termination case anymore. There are 53 companies that have been operating for 12 months without knowing who actually compromised their data, without knowing that the person responsible is still out there and still doing this. Looked at the ceiling. 53 companies, their client files, their records, their exposures, sitting out there in whatever Adler had done with them, while Dion sat in an incident report as the cause, while those companies made decisions about their security based on a lie. "Yeah," he said it quietly. "Yeah." Greer watched him for a moment. "We're going to need a full statement from you tonight. Everything about Meridian, the breach, what you saw in the logs before they terminated you, any documentation you kept." "I kept everything," Dion said. Greer looked at him. "I kept every email, every log file, every communication from the HR process, every letter from the attorney." Dion met his eyes, "'cause I knew it wasn't me, and I knew that someone was going to need to see it." Greer was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said. "Just that." Then he went back into the room. Dion stayed in the hallway. He thought about the drive from Cincinnati to Harlow Creek 10 months ago. The early October morning. The rental truck. The single playlist he'd put on does because silence was too loud and talk radio required too talk tolerance for other people's certainty. He had pulled onto Crestfield Lane at 7 in the morning when the street was just waking up and the oak trees were still holding most of their leaves, and he had sat in the truck for a moment before going inside because he had wanted to feel the whether this was the right place. He had felt something like yes, not safety exactly. Something smaller than safety. Something that felt like the possibility of being ordinary, of being a man who worked from home and kept his yard neat and didn't need to explain himself to anyone. He had felt that, and someone had already been setting up the infrastructure to watch him 9.5 months ago, before he signed the lease, before he found the listing. The first message from Adler's account to Joel had been sent 9.5 months ago, which meant the groundwork was being laid, while Dion was still in a motel room outside Cincinnati, trying to figure out where to go next. Adler had known before Dion knew, which meant Adler had been watching for longer than 9 weeks. He had been tracking Dion's movements, his searches, his communications, through whatever access he still had or had retained from Meridian, had sent Dion looking at rental listings, had identified Harlow Creek, had found Joel through a security forum and made contact, and had the whole architecture in place. Team Dion pulled a rental truck onto Crestfield Lane on a Tuesday morning in October. Dion had thought he was starting over. He had been walking into a room that was already set up. He stood in the hallway and let that land without flinching. Then he went downstairs. Brenda was at the kitchen table. She had made tea. There was a second mug on the table, steam still rising from it, set across from her own. Nobody had asked for it. She had made it anyway. The way people do things in crisis that are more about having something to do with their hands than anything else. She looked up when Dion came into the kitchen. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked at her mug, then at him, the expression of a woman who had been sitting alone for 40 minutes, building up to a conversation, and was now not sure how to start it. He put her out of her misery. "I'm not here to revisit the last 4 hours," he said. "I want to say something, and then I'll leave you to it." She waited. When this becomes public, and it will, because 11 households means 11 sets of people who are going to be told what happened to their cameras and their networks, people on this street are going to be upset, scared, angry, looking for someone to explain it to them. He paused. "I need you to tell the truth, the full truth. What you knew, what you didn't know, what you saw, what you assumed, all of it." Brenda's chin came up slightly. "I know that. Not a version that protects anyone's feelings," he said, "including your own." She held his gaze. "I understand." He looked at her for a moment, at the set of her jaw, which was more resolute than he expected and less defensive than it might have been. "The People Street deserve the full story," he said, "not a comfortable version of it." "I know," she said, and she said it with a directness that was different from the certainty she'd had on her porch that afternoon. That certainty had been borrowed from assumption. This was something she had arrived at herself. He nodded, started to stand. "Mr. Garrett," she said. "Stopped." He stopped. She was looking at him with the expression of a woman who had something to say and knew before she said it that it was going to be insufficient. But she was going to say it anyway, because society of failure. "I built a picture of you," she said, "in my head." She paused. "Not because I was afraid of you. I never tried." She looked at her hands. "I just decided I knew something, and I acted on it. And it was just a feeling I dressed up as certainty." Dion looked at her. He thought about Clint Adler, sat 2 desks Spolskus away for 7 years and brought coffee and said you're going to be fine and had been doing something unforgivable the entire time. He thought about trust and proximity and how the two things can exist completely separately. How closeness is not the same as knowing. How dressed up as certainty is one of the most dangerous things a person can carry. "That one's familiar," he said. She looked at him. He didn't explain. She seemed to understand that he wasn't throwing it at her. He was placing it between them as a thing they had in common, which was not the same thing at all. He stood up. "Next time you see something that doesn't make sense," he said, "knock on the door. Ask the question." She nodded slowly. "That's it?" she said. "That's it," he said. "That's the whole thing." He walked back through her living room at the front door into the October evening and crossed the street to his own house. He did not look back, but behind him he heard her door close, gently. Greer called at 6:47 the next morning. Dion was already awake, had been for an hour, lying in the half-dark watching nothing teen and letting his brain do what it insisted on doing in the early mornings, which was run the counting. Every piece, every connection, every hour of the last 12 months laid out in sequence. This time, for the first time, the accounting had an ending. "They made contact last night at 11, Greer said. Columbus field office. Adler retained counsel immediately. Dion sat up, which tells you what you need to know. He wasn't surprised, Greer said. His attorney's statement this morning was prepared, which means either Adler anticipated this at some point, or his attorney is very good at working fast. A pause. I'm inclined toward the first option. What happens now? He's been formally notified of the investigation. Travel restricted. His current employer being pulled this morning under a warrant. Greer paused. His employer placed him on administrative leave within 2 hours of being contacted. Another company. Another man being walked to an elevator. Different man this time. The right one. Meridian Angle. Dion said. The original breach. The 53 client. That's going to run on its own timeline. But the Columbus DA's office is aware and the information is in the right hands. I can't give you a schedule, but it's moving. Dion stood, walked to the window, looked at Crestfield Lane in the early morning. The Oaks in October, the light coming in flat and gray, Tom Briley's car still in his driveway, a woman 3 houses down from the front walk. Ordinary. All of it. Your attorney. Ort, Greer said. Call her today. I will. The material from Joel's laptop, the messages, the payment records, the timeline. It's directly relevant to your civil case. Your attorney needs to see it as soon as we can release it. How long? Few days. We'll expedite given the circumstances. Dion looked at the street. At the spot in his driveway where he had stood yesterday afternoon with his phone, run a trace, not knowing that 42 meters away, in a bedroom painted in deep blue LED light, that there was a folder with his name on it, and 9 weeks of his life inside it. Greer, he said. Yeah. Yesterday morning I woke up at 6, made coffee, took a client call at 10. I wasn't going to do anything about the note except reset the password and change the router configuration. Why didn't you? Dion thought about it. Because I recognized it, he said, and I couldn't let myself not know if I was right. Greer was quiet for a moment. Then, you were right. Yeah. Exhaled 12 months late. But yeah. He called Paula Reeves at 8:15. She was his employment attorney. She had taken his case 18 months ago on a reduced fee structure because she had read the Meridian incident report and told plainly that whoever had framed him had done a sloppy job, and she found that professionally offensive. He had liked her for that, not for the sympathy. For the offense, he walked her through everything. The note, Joel. The messages, partials, email. The Columbus Field office. Greer's contact information. The full account history Aldridge was packaging for the DA. She's quiet for 30 seconds when he finished. The 30 seconds from Paula Reeves was the equivalent of a long speech from anyone else. Dion, she said. Yeah, do you understand what this does to your case? I'm starting to. The wrong turtle Sherman claim was for solid for this, but the evidence was circumstantial. We could prove the logs were wrong, but we couldn't prove who made them wrong, and a jury responds to logs. Logs feel objective. She paused. But now we have documented communication between Adler and a third party, payment records. A timeline that shows Adler was actively surveilling you after your termination, which speaks directly to consciousness of guilt. He didn't stop because he was confident he'd gotten away with it. He kept going because he was afraid you'd eventually find your way back to the truth. He was right to be afraid, Dion said. Yes, Paula said. He was. A beat. Are you prepared for what the full process looks like? Walk me through it. Civil suit against Meridian for wrongful termination. That's us. Criminal proceedings, potentially the original data breach. That's the DA. Joel's case running parallel. These are 3 separate tracks that will intersect and influence each other in ways we'll need to monitor carefully. She paused. 18 months minimum, possibly 2 years, a lot of hours in rooms with lawyers. Dion looked out the kitchen window at the Thursday morning street. I've got time, he said. Good. He heard her opening something on her computer, already moving, several steps ahead. I'll contact Greer this morning and start on the documentation request. And Dion. The material from Joel's laptop, when we get access to it, I want to look at everything. Don't filter it. Don't decide what's relevant. Send me everything. Paula. Yeah. Thank you, he said, for taking the case when the math didn't add up. A pause that was different from her usual pauses. Shorter. Less calculated. Get some breakfast, she said. It's going to be a long day. The notifications went out on Friday. Greer's team, with 2 officers from the county, knocked on 11 doors and delivered 11 versions of the same information. Your home network was accessed without permission. Your security cameras were compromised. Footage was recorded over a period of up to 9 weeks. A suspect is in custody and cooperating with investigators. Here is what you need to do tonight to secure your system. When this client work. A healthcare company proposal that had been due Thursday and was now a day late, which he had emailed to explain without going into detail. He worked steadily for 3 hours and did not check his phone and did not look out the window more than twice. He heard things anyway. A man's voice from somewhere down the street, carrying in the way voice dues do in October when people leave windows open during the day for the last stretch of bearable weather. Anger, the specific anger of someone who feels violated and needs a direction to point it in. He heard a woman cry briefly and then stop. He heard nothing from the direction of Brenda's house, which probably meant something. Saturday morning, Brenda walked to 4 houses on the street. He found out later, not from her directly, but from the accumulated knowledge that comes from living somewhere. She had told the truth in the way she had said she would. What she saw, what she did, what she found out, what she had assumed and why she had assumed it and how wrong she had been. She did not make herself a victim of it. She said of disciplinedness, accountable for her part, honest about what her call had and hadn't been best on. She had also, from what Dion gathered, told people who had actually found the breach. Dion Garrett across the street. He found it. He's the reason we know. He found out about this on Saturday afternoon when a woman named Shirley, who lived 2 houses down and had a garden that she tended with the dedication of someone who had decided this was what her time was for, rang his doorbell with a container of what she called her grandmother's pound cake and said, simply, "Thank you." Dion stood in his doorway. He had not been thanked for anything in a long time, not in the way that reached the place where it was supposed to reach. He had been thanked in the fresh way, client emails and end-of-contract acknowledgments, which were genuine enough but landed on the surface of things. This landed differently. "Thank you," he said back, and meant it in a way that surprised him. 2 weeks after that, Thursday afternoon, Adler was fully charged, wire fraud, unauthorized access to protect computer, identity fraud, and, once the Meridian client data was fully audited by the federal team, theft of trade secrets, the kind of charges that have numbers attached to them that change what the rest of a person's life looks like. Paula, core in the afternoon, with her voice at the particular frequency of someone who has won something and is being professional about celebrating it. "The indictment came down this morning, Fetix," she said. Dion put his pen down and, Meridian. "Their legal team called me yesterday. They want to discuss it to terms." A pause, which means they've done the math on what it looks like to a jury in front of the evidence that they terminated a black engineer based on falsified flocks without a single independent forensic review. Dion quiet for a moment. "What kind of settlement? We'll talk numbers next week. But I want you to understand your position. You have to take the first number if you don't have to take it. If you want to go to trial, we go to trial and I think we win." She paused. "But you have options. Real ones. And the choice of which option is entirely yours." He thought about that word, options. 12 months ago, he had a sidewalk and a laptop bag and 2 contacts he could call without it being uncomfortable. Now he had options. "I'll call you Monday," he said. She confirmed. "And Dion, you did the hard part. You found it and you told the truth about it, and you stayed in the room when it would have been easier to walk away." He thought about the hallway outside Joel's bedroom, the carpet runner and the faded crosscost, and the sound of Brenda making tea downstairs. "I almost walked away," he said. "But you didn't," she said. He didn't answer that, because she was right, and he didn't need to say so. Joel Kowalski entered a guilty plea 6 weeks after his arrest. Unlawful surveillance. Unauthorized access to a computer network. 11 counts, 1 for each household. He was 22, with no prior record and a defense attorney who had made the great comments clearly and consistently from the first day. The sentence was 18 months probation, significant community service hours, and mandatory withdrawal from his degree program, pending a university conduct review. No prison time. Dion was not asked his opinion on the sentencing. He was asked by the victim advocate whether he wanted to submit a written statement to the court. He sat with that for 2 days. Then he wrote 4 paragraphs. He did not write about anger. He wrote about what it meant to have a private life turned into someone else's data set. To exist inside your own home without knowing that existing was being recorded. To build something, a routine, a rhythm. You could let your guard down for 20 minutes and have that place be an illusion you hadn't allowed to know it was one. He wrote that Joel was 22 and had made choices that would follow him, that the choices had a human cost, and that the human cost was not abstract or theoretical. It had an address. It had a face. It had been standing in a driveway at 2:47 on the Thursday afternoon trying to figure out why his internet was slow. He wrote that he hoped Joel understood the difference between what something technically is and what it actually does to the person on the other side of it. And then in the fourth paragraph, he wrote one more thing. He wrote that technical capability is not permission, that being able to see something does not mean you have the right to look, that the gap between those two things is not a technicality or a legal abstraction. It is the entire foundation of what it means to share space with other human beings. He submitted it and did not attend the hearing. The civil settlement with Meridian was reached in the early months of the new year. He could not discuss the specific terms. Paula had advised accepting the confidentiality clause because the number made it worth it, and she was right, and he agreed. What the settlement included, and what he was permitted to acknowledge, was a formal written acknowledgement that his termination had been based on fraudulent evidence and did not reflect his performance, conduct, or integrity during his 7 years of employment. Not a non-admission, not without prejudice, boilerplate, an acknowledgement. A paper that said in careful legal language, this was wrong. This man did not do what we said he did. The record is corrected. Paula mailed him a copy. He folded it and put it in the top drawer of his desk, framed, not displayed, not shown to anyone, just there, in the drawer. In case there was ever a morning when he needed to open it once and close it and open again. He had not needed to open yet. He thought he probably wouldn't. But it mattered that it was there. Adler's criminal case moved at the pace federal cases move, which is slowly, and with the deliberate thoroughness of a process that understands it needs to be correct more than it needs to be fast. Dion had been told to expect a year before trial, possibly longer. He had prepared himself for the long version. He had his attorney, his documentation, the encrypted message archive, the payment records, the note architecture, all of it preserved and organized and ready. He stopped checking the federal docket every day, sometime around the 5th week, not because he stopped caring, because he understood at some point between the 5th and 6th week the difference between caring about something and watching for it. One was a state of being, the other was just tough walking in circles. He had spent 12 months watching. He was done with that part. November came to Crestfield Lane, the way November always did, not dramatically. The oaks let go of their leaves over the course of about 10 days in a way that felt both gradual and sudden. And one morning the sidewalks were covered in something that needed to be dealt with. Dion got out his rake on a Saturday morning. He had not done this last year. Last year, he had arranged for the yard service to handle it because he hadn't wanted to be visible on his own front lawn for extended periods, which was a thing he would not have been able to write down at the time, because he had not been examining it closely enough to tame it. He was outside for 2 hours. His neighbor from 3 houses down, a man named Tom Briley, whose name Dion had learned at approximately the 6-week mark of living here and then rarely used, came over with his own rake and started working the strip of leaves that had blown into the boundary between their properties. They worked without talking for a while. Then Tom said, "Garrett, right?" "Yeah, Tom Briley." They shook hands in the slightly awkward of two people holding rakes. "Heard what you did," Tom said. Dion didn't respond to that. "My wife's been on this street 32 years, Tom continued. She was pretty shaken up about the camera thing, the bedroom. He paused, but she said at least someone was paying attention. Dion looked at the pile of leaves at the curb. "Hey, anyone would have caught it," he said, "if they were looking." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Maybe," he said. In the tone of him, I wasn't entirely sure that was true, but wasn't going to argue. They raked for a few more minutes. "You want to come in for coffee?" Tom said. "Marcy makes too much. Always has." Dion looked at his yard, at the clean sidewalk, the neat line of leaves at the curb. The house behind him with its beige ties and black sweaters, black straps, ordinary in all the ways he had needed it to be ordinary when he signed the lease. He thought about all the Saturdays he had timed his trips to the mailbox to avoid running into people. All the evenings he had waited until the street was empty before going to his car. All the careful smallness he had worn, Because smallness felt explosive than being seen, and he had been exposed enough. He thought about what that smallness had cost him. Not the job, not the year. Adler had taken those. He thought about the version of himself he had set aside. The one who said yes to coffee. The one who raked his own leaves without calculating the visibility. The one who waved from the driveway without running a quick threat assessment first. That version hadn't been gone. He had just put somewhere for safekeeping and then lost track of where he'd put it. Yeah, he said. Coffee sounds good. On a Thursday morning in late January, exact 3 months after the afternoon that had unraveled everything, Dion sat at his desk and opened his laptop. 2 client calls before noon. A proposal due by end of week. Work he understood, work he was good at, work that had continued throughout everything. Because the thing about a freelance network security practice is that networks don't stop needing to be secured. Because your life is complicated. He ran the router check first. He would always run the router check first. That was not going to change. Not because of fear. Because of the specific understanding that a network is a living thing, and living things require attention, and attention is not the same as anxiety, no matter how the two things can look from the outside. Everything clean. All devices recognized. All traffic patterns normal. He made coffee and stood at the kitchen window while it brewed. Crestfield Lane in January, moving slowly in the way of streets in cold months. The oaks bare now, angular against the white sky. A woman with a stroller far sidewalk walk, moving at the pace of someone who has somewhere to be, but is allowing themselves to take the long way. Tom Briley's car was backing out of his driveway. The hydrangea bush at Brenda's house, cut back for winter, brown and bare, looked like it was gathering itself for spring. He had spoken to Brenda 3 times since the night he had sat at her kitchen table. Not long conversations, not resolved ones. The specific brief exchanges that happen between people who share a street and a history that is complicated in ways that will probably always be at least a little complicated. She asked once if he thought things would go back to normal. He had thought about it honestly before answering. I don't know what normal was, he said. I'd only moved here 10 days ago. She had laughed. Small, surprised, the laugh of someone who walked into something they didn't expect to find funny and found it funny anyway. He hadn't expected it either. He thought about that laugh sometimes. About all the small, ordinary things that had not been possible until they were. About how lupus in ways you don't notice it until you're standing in it. The coffee was ready. He poured it, sat down, opened the client file for the healthcare company, and read for a moment before starting to write. Outside Crestfield Lane continued its January morning. The router lights blinked their steady rhythm behind him. Clean. Recognized his. He had spent sniffed. Slowly, then all at once. His credentials, his name, his record, his 7 years of clean, careful work. Someone had taken all of it and reassigned it to a story that had nothing to do with him. And the institutions that were supposed to look closely had looked at the logs instead, and the logs had said what Adler had told them to say. And Dion had been left with a sidewalk and a laptop bag, and the understanding that being innocent was not, by itself, sufficient. He had spent 12 months being careful, invisibly, deliberately careful, making him small enough to move through the world without friction, without him giving him a reason to look twice. What he understood now, sitting at his desk on a Thursday morning in January with coffee and a proposal, and the router lights blinking clean behind him, was that the smallness had been a response to something real. The threat had been real. The danger of being seen and misread had been real. And the consequences of it had been real, and the careful, invisible life had for reasonable adaptation to a situation that required adapting to. But it had also been a cost. Not Adler's cost, though Adler had created the condition. His own cost, paid in small daily increments. The mailbox trips timed to empty streets. The raking he had paid someone else to do. The waves he had calculated instead of given. The coffee he hadn't had with Tom freely for 10 months when Tom had been standing in his yard with a rake and too much coffee the whole time. He was not going to be angry about that. He was just going to stop paying it. He worked until noon. Then he made a second cup of coffee and stood at the window again for a few minutes before his first call. Just standing, just looking at the street. Crestfield Lane looked back at him the way streets do when they are not particularly paying attention, which is to say completely indifferently, which is exactly what a street is supposed to do. He had the right to be here. He had always had the right to be here. The difference was that now the street knew it too. And next week, and the week after that, and for as long as he chose to stay on this corner lot with its attached garage and its good morning light in the kitchen, he was going to stand at the window and drink his coffee and watch the ordinary life of Crestfield Lane without calculating how long was too long to be visible. He was going to rake his own leaves. He was going to wave from the driveway. He was going to say yes to coffee. Not because the world had changed, because he had decided to stop disappearing from it. The signal was clean, and Dion Garrett was exactly where he was supposed to be.